Hey strangers, my name is Kayla and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you are returning. I use this channel as a space to talk about all things horror. Today I am going to be doing my first book review. I am titling this Baby's First Disturbing Book, but that's kind of a lie. Sorry, I lied to you. The first time I ever read a disturbing book was when I was 13 years old. For extra credit in the 8th grade, I read Night by Elie Wiesel, who, was a Holocaust survivor. And of course, if you don't know and you've never read the book, it is a first-person account of his experience during the Holocaust. So naturally very disturbing, but in my opinion, necessary, of course. Regardless, dating myself, but that was about 20 years ago, maybe a little more. And so recently I have been looking all over the internet for what other people have determined to be other disturbing books to read, to kind of see what they're all about, and see what I think about them. And I think for those of us who have been into horror for a very long time, we become desensitized. And so it's kind of like almost feels like a challenge. Like someone will be like, oh, this is the scariest movie I've ever seen or the most disturbing book I've ever read. And it's kind of like, okay, try me, So I'm going to be talking about two fairly well-regarded books today. The first book is, I don't know if you can see it, Tender as the Flesh. Tender as the Flesh is by Agustina Bazterrica. I'm not going to try it with Spanish accent because it's going to sound stupid. She's from Argentina. This book was first published in Spanish in 2017 and translated to English in 2020 by Sarah Moses. I am going to, whenever I review a book or a movie, I'm going to give some trigger warnings or content warnings because I don't vibe with the idea that, if you're going into a horror movie or book, you shouldn't need trigger warnings. If you have any trigger warnings, don't consume this media, because that's not fair. I can't do animal cruelty, but I have a pretty strong stomach for almost everything else. And it's not fair to have to avoid an entire genre because of that one thing, right? And of course, as a therapist, for some of us, we don't want to or need to be re-traumatized. So depending on the book's content, we may want a heads up so we can kind of steel ourselves, or we may just want to avoid it altogether. So the trigger warning for this is cannibalism. That's what the book is about. It's about cannibalism. The book is about cannibalism. Gore, body horror, torture. There's one very brief but explicit scene of animal cruelty that was pretty hard for me to read, but it's only maybe like a page or two. And in my opinion, not really necessary to the plot. So really, if you wanted to skip it, you could. I want to also lay out, before I get into all of that, I want to tell you a little bit about how I read books and what's important to me in books. So I write creatively. I'm not a professional writer. I'm not a published writer. I'm not an editor. I don't have an English degree. I'm not Shakespeare. However, I'm a very critical reader because I like to write and because I have a lot of respect for that craft. So when I DNF a book, it really doesn't take a lot. Poor writing, and by that I mean like spelling and grammar errors that are pretty easily avoidable. I give a little bit of leeway to people who are self-published because, people who are self-publishing their books don't have a lot of money to be, well, I shouldn't say they don't have a lot of money. I don't know that, but an editor costs thousands of dollars, and some people either aren't able or just aren't willing to put money into that. But you can have a family member or friend read it, proofread it for you. It's not that hard. Although again, I can see some genres like extreme horror, maybe you don't want to do that. There are always beta readers out there. So basic spelling and grammar errors, no plot or a nonsensical plot, poor structure, no character development, weird or bad or unrealistic dialogue. When I have to really suspend my disbelief in a book, it really takes me out of it. It takes me out of the immersion of it. So like when a supernatural or fantastical scene pops out of nowhere, it's not for me. So it's really important to me to have those sort of, I sound like such a snob, but like those basic things in place so that I can read a book. But just so you know, I'm a very critical reader, and probably part of the reason why I haven't published any of my work is because I assume that everyone is going to be just as critical as I am, which is just not true. Tender as the Flesh. Back to Tender as the Flesh. So this is a dystopian novel where the main concept of the book is that all animal products have suddenly become deadly, poisonous to all human beings. So after the transition, any non-human animals have been exterminated and humans have begun to be bred for meat. It almost lost me there because, I really had to suspend my disbelief to think that people would rather be cannibals than vegans. Like, I know about the hate that vegans get, but you would really rather eat other people than be a vegan? Like, come on. But then I think it was Goodreads, I saw this comment where somebody was like, you don't understand how passionately Argentinians feel about their meat. So like maybe there's a cultural component I'm missing there. I would much rather be vegan than eat people. But tell me in the comments if you feel the same. Don't say like, yeah, I would rather be a cannibal, because you might get put on a list. But, let me know your thoughts. The main character is Marcos, who works as a higher-up at a slaughterhouse while supporting his father, Don Armando, who is dying from dementia in supportive care. He is decidedly vegetarian/vegan. We know that from the outset. He kind of presents himself as this like very moralistic character in this very wild west of a dystopian world. He's a tragic character who is living separated from his wife, Cecilia, after the death of their baby son, Leo. So what I liked about this book was that it was well written. I believe this was Bazterrica's debut novel. And I think she did a really good job with it. It's a challenging topic. It's an interesting topic. It's an interesting concept. I thought the characters were good. They were fairly well fleshed out. No pun intended. The pacing was good, and it had moments that had me questioning, well, what would I do if I lived in this world? I mean, there's a whole part where Marcos goes into this story of like how he had these two dogs that he grew up with that during the transition he had to put them down. And I believe, because I read this like a month or so ago, but I believe he talks about how he has a moment of like, what if I just take my dogs and run instead of killing them? And he talks about the consequences of that you could also be killed for disobeying those laws and those orders put out by the government. Marcos' sister, Marisa, and her children serve as a stark contrast to Marcos and exemplify how far society has slipped since the transition. So Marcos is kind of constantly, we're in his head, so we're hearing his thoughts and we're seeing things from his point of view. And he's constantly thinking about how not great things are. And he's reminiscing on how things were before the transition and kind of mourning that more polite society that no longer exists. And his sister Marisa is just like fully immersed here. One of the things that is constantly mentioned is the fear of birds, because obviously you can't just get rid of all birds everywhere. They're going to fly. And so people walk around with umbrellas so that they don't get like pooped on or they don't get attacked by a bird. And Marcos thinks it's bullshit, so he doesn't do that. And him and his sister have a moment where she's like, where's your umbrella? Where's your umbrella? And he's like, I literally don't care. But Marisa has this secret, after their father passes away. Marcos attends what do we call a post-funeral gathering? I know that there's a word for it, but I forgot. So anyways, the post-funeral gathering, whatever we want to call it, he finds out that she is or has been keeping this like head of I think what they call like pure bred meat or something like that. So like this really prime, genetically prime human that she's slaughtered to serve at the party, which is illegal. Like you can't in this world keep your own person for consumption. What I didn't like about this book, my biggest issue was, again, like I said, I was suspending my disbelief. But after I was able to do that, or I said, you know what, okay, let's just see where this goes. Everything thereafter, I think, is pretty believable in terms of how the characters react to everything that's going on in the world. I mean, we saw how people reacted to a global pandemic, and this concept was not all that different. So I wouldn't be surprised if you had your people who were like completely neurotic about it, and then you had your people who were just like pretending it wasn't happening and living thusly. I think I'd agree with a lot of the criticisms I saw on Goodreads about how it's a little too, not on the nose, but it holds our hand a little bit too much. So Marcos is our guide. He's our link to this world. He's our guide. And he just kind of like over explains things, basically. So why people have come up with the names for the cuts of meat that they request at the butcher shop. So they kind of fall back into using the same terminology that you would use, you know, if you go to a butcher to get meat, and calling them head instead of like people, or giving them names, right? They don't have names, they have numbers or whatever, which is exactly, you know, that's how we treat animals who are going to slaughter, of course. But like, no shit. I mean, no surprise, in my opinion, that the reaction that people have is to distance themselves as far as possible away from the depravity that they're allegedly being forced into. Because again, it could just be vegan. It's not like vegetables don't exist anymore. Some of the ideas that Bazterrica has in this novel seem as though they could have been explored more. So like there's a faction, if you want to call it that, of characters called scavengers who live on the fringes of society, and they steal what they can for food. So there's a whole scene where they like tip over a delivery truck of head that's going out of or into the slaughterhouse or something like that. And kind of the ensuing chaos that occurs after. But it's like, I want to know more. Tell me more about like who these people are. Why do they live this way? Like why those people and not everyone else? What choices or consequences have led to them being like feral, essentially, because that's how she describes them, as almost like non-human themselves. And I feel like there's commentary there about like class, and potentially, because honestly, this is all a critique, I believe, of capitalism. You know, you want to say off the cuff that this is like a critique of the meat industry, and I'm sure that's in there somewhere, but I think overall it's a critique on capitalism. And so this idea that you have these people who are living on the fringes of society because of what they can't afford to live the way that everybody else is living, or they've been forgotten, they slip through the cracks, but she never really elaborates on that. And they're just kind of, they serve almost as like a bump in the road for our main character in the plot. So even bigger than that, Marcos hints several times that he doesn't believe that the virus at the heart of this is even real. He thinks the government has made it up. And I was like, tell me more. I want to know where you're going with that. Is there any substance to that? I would have liked to see him like investigate, or even just like find some history documents that kind of contradict what they believed was happening, or what they told people was happening, and what was actually happening. Because I think that would have been a really interesting layer of complexity to add to the story, especially if we had some dramatic irony where Marcos knew and everybody else didn't, or we, the reader, knew and nobody else in the story knew what was going on or what the truth was. At the end, I did not like the end, because it felt very much like we were building Marcos up to be this character who served as like this bastion of the past, this connection to the past in terms of his values, his morals. And to be fair, there's a breaking down of him as a character, and especially after his father passes away, who is his link to the past and his former life. But, you know, spoiler alert, he takes a woman home from the slaughterhouse, names her Jasmine, gripes her because I don't know that these people being bred as stock are in a position to consent, but she ends up pregnant. She has this baby. The baby kind of like, so she serves as a surrogate for Marcos and Cecilia. And so Jasmine gives birth to this baby, and then they just kill her to eat her, which is really indicative of how far Marcos has slipped in no longer seeing Jasmine as a human being, despite the fact that he named her. So overall, I would give this book a 3 or maybe a 3.5. I mean, it definitely was not a bad book. There was like a little oomph missing, I think. I would recommend read it, check it out, tell me what you think. We might have a different experience. So the next book that I'm reviewing, I can't show you the cover for whatever reason. My books app won't let me pull it up. But it's Earthlings by Japanese author Sayaka Murata. It was originally published in 2018 and was translated into English in 2020 by Ginny Tapley Takamori. Trigger warnings for this book would be child abuse, sexual assault, trauma, murder, gore, cannibalism, bullying, and attempted unaliving of the self. So I think this is Murata's 10th novel, but I think it's the second that was translated into English. But either way, it follows her novel Convenience Store Woman, which was published in 2016. And both books follow similar main themes of feelings of alienation and the consequences of nonconformity within a society. I haven't read Convenience Store Woman, but that's kind of like the overall summary of it. And then quite honestly, both books are giving the neurodivergent experience, right? Like being neurodivergent in a world that expects you to be neurotypical and says, you know, too bad that you can't conform. You have to live this way. These are our rules. So Earthlings follows Natsuki Sakamoto throughout her childhood and into adulthood. Early on, she explains that she feels like an outsider. She's got this plush hedgehog named Piyut, who she tells us is actually an emissary sent by the magic police on planet Popopopia. I hope I'm saying that right. That's kind of how I was pronouncing it in my head throughout the book. Her mother is emotionally and verbally abusive, and her father is stoic and quiet. Her older sister, Kiko, appears to be favored by both parents. So Kiko is anxious, but they kind of bend to her needs where Natsuki needs something. They're just kind of like, go over there. We don't care. Like you're being dramatic, whatever. So every year her family gathers to celebrate the Buddhist holiday of Obon, where Natsuki has a chance to see her cousin Yu. And the two become very close over their shared sense of alienation, and Yu declares that he is in fact an alien. Now, when this book first begins, they're probably like, I want to say Natsuki is like 8 or something like that, and I think Yu is a little bit older than her. So behind the scenes, what's happening is that Yu is serving as an emotional surrogate to his own mother after his father dies. Like, mom forces him to call her by her first name, and it's not, to my recollection, there's no sexual abuse going on there, but there's definitely like, mom is leaning on him way too much emotionally and parentifying him, you know, expecting him to do the things around the house that his father did and be responsible for those things. And he's like 10, he's in elementary school. So one of the things that happens over the course of a few years at this, the grandmother's house in Akashina, is that Natsuki and Yu decide that they want to be boyfriend and girlfriend, and then they get married. So there's a pretty rough scene in this book of sexual assault. Natsuki's teacher grooms her and assaults her. And the trauma response that she has feels too accurate to be fiction. And what I mean by that is, I hope this is not true, but Murata seems to have an intimate knowledge of what that trauma response looks like. I was lucky enough that I did not experience sexual abuse as a child. However, I'm a therapist, so helping other people work through that and seeing the impacts of survivors on survivors of this kind of abuse, it just nail on the head. And so she experiences dissociation during and after this experience. She internalizes all of the verbal and emotional abuse from her mother and other people. And she begins to kind of play act this sexual abuse with her cousin Yu. So during one of the summers, they talk about, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, not culminating their marriage, you know, like making their marriage official. I don't know what that's called. So she, I don't know if we want to call it assaults him, but that's certainly how it feels to him. He tells us later on, they get caught by the rest of the family. And as you can imagine, it's like this huge thing. And she is not allowed to go back to Agustina. She's not allowed to talk to you. She's not allowed to see you or anybody else in the family. Even like her grandmother dies and she's not allowed to go to the funeral. So years later, Natsuki gets married and we find out that she's met her husband on what is essentially a forum for hikikomori, or people in, well, I mean, everywhere really, but it's the Japanese word for people who are reclusive and don't really want relationships with other people. I guess you could describe both Natsuki and her husband as aromantic. Her husband is definitely asexual as well. Natsuki, not so much, but we find out that her husband was traumatized as a child by being forced to bathe with his mother until the age of 15. So he is completely repulsed by the idea of a nude woman. Even, you know, when they're living together, Natsuki can't wear pants that like roll up too far. It's almost like Amish porn. Like he can't even see her ankles really. And they schedule things such that they eat dinner separately, and like they're really like ships passing in the night. They barely even make conversation with one another. But Tomoya, her husband, is completely obsessed with the idea of what he calls the factory. And the factory is society, essentially. So it's the pressure that they feel to fit in and do all of these things, like hit these milestones, like go to college, get married, have babies, all of these things that they're supposed to do, they feel is programming by the factory, and they're trying to essentially like deprogram themselves, but they can't because they have to exist within the society. And Tomoya can't like hold down a job, and because he doesn't feel like he has to follow those rules. Like he doesn't feel like he has to be at work on time or like go to bed at a good hour so that he can get up in time and stuff like that. The book culminates with Natsuki, Yu, and Tomoya striking out on their own at Natsuki's family home in Akashina to live outside of society, which quickly becomes deadly, however, not for any of those three characters. I think for a lot of us, the ending felt very out of pocket. It was very much like, wait, what am I reading right now? Wait, what just happened right now? How did that book just end? So what I liked about it was that it was very well written. It uses magical realism, and I felt that although a lot of time passes in the book, the pacing is really good. So, you know, we really follow Natsuki from elementary age all the way into adulthood, and it doesn't feel like that much time passes, if that makes sense. And we additionally learn more and more about her as she's learning more about herself, which I thought was interesting. And like I said before, the depiction of the trauma response feels too accurate to be made up. Natsuki experiences dissociation during and after the trauma, as well as internalization of the verbal and physical abuse, which brought me to tears. I mean, there's a scene where she's walking with her mom, and one of the neighbors comes out and is like, "Oh, you're such a good girl. You're such a good kid. You do what you're told," and blah, blah, blah. And the mom is like, "Oh, you should see what she's like behind closed doors." And she's just insulting her and being really mean about it. And the neighbor lady is like, "What's your problem, lady?" But she just kind of insists, like, "No, she's a good girl. She's a good girl." And Natsuki's like, "No, my mom's right. I'm like a terrible person. She's correct." And that scene, I was in tears because nobody deserves that, but especially not a child. So there was very little I disliked about this book, quite honestly, although the ending is really out of pocket and seemed to be the part that most people on Goodreads disliked. I feel a lot of folks over there kind of missed the point that she was trying to make about this feeling of being othered and not fitting in, and the impact that can have, and the cause of that, right? Because for these three people who have this interesting ending, they've all experienced trauma as children, and the consequence for them was very dire. And I think that a lot of people that read it on Goodreads were like honing in too much on those like scenes of gore and violence, and not enough on like the overarching theme. But, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. If you read it and didn't like it, fine. We're all going to have different experiences with the media that we consume. So I can love it and you can dislike it, and both of those things are valid. But overall, I think I would give this book a 4 out of 5, and I definitely recommend it. But just be aware of the trigger warnings, because it's very intense and you may need to just skip it if it's something that would be triggering for you. And I mean that in the therapist way, not in the colloquialism way. So that was Tender as the Flesh and Earthlings. If you read these books, tell me what you thought about them. If there are any recommendations that you have for me based off of those, I would love to hear it. But I will be back soon with a couple more reviews of a few more books that I read. And I will see you soon. I hope you have a lovely day. I don't know why I just sang that. That was terrible. Okay, I'm gonna stop now. Bye.